Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the Spanish Empire. We think of empires as monolithic entities, vast powers that expand from a strong unified core. Rome, for instance, had its 7 hills, then its legions, then its sprawling dominion. The British Empire had its island, its navy, its factories. But Spain, the land we know today as Spain, spent nearly 800 years, from 711 CE to 1492 CE, in a state of almost constant internal warfare. It was a fragmented peninsula, a jagged mosaic of Christian kingdoms and Muslim emirates, constantly shifting alliances, betrayals, and bloody skirmishes. It was a frontier, a crucible, a land perpetually defined by conflict and the struggle for survival. Yet, from this improbable, chaotic, and often seemingly backward corner of Europe, the world's first truly global empire would emerge, an empire that, within a single century, would stretch from the Philippines to Florida, from the silver mines of Potosi to the spice islands of the Moluccas. How does a land so utterly consumed by its own internal strife, so seemingly unsuited for grand unified projects, suddenly give birth to such an unprecedented, audacious, and historically transformative power? It's a contradiction that, once you dig into it, reveals the very DNA of what would become the Spanish Empire. It's a story not of inherent strength, but of a strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle, a relentless drive born of desperation and faith. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks about the Spanish Empire. How did it even begin? Seriously, how does a country that spent 7 centuries fighting itself, a collection of squabbling kingdoms, suddenly explode onto the global stage, discover new continents, and establish a dominion that would literally girdle the earth? It's not a tale of inevitable destiny, but of a series of desperate gambles, brutal conquests, and a cultural identity forged in the fires of a struggle unlike almost any other in European history. To understand Spain's improbable rise, we have to rewind way back, before there was even a Spain as we know it, to a peninsula that was perpetually on the edge of chaos. Before the Spanish Empire could even be a glimmer in anyone's eye, the Iberian Peninsula, that chunk of land jutting out into the Atlantic, had already been a crossroads for millennia. The Romans had called it Hispania, and they'd spent centuries integrating it into their vast empire, building roads, cities, and introducing Latin, which would eventually evolve into the Spanish language. But by the 5th century CE, as the Roman Empire crumbled, Hispania, like much of Western Europe, was overrun by Germanic tribes. The Visigoths, a powerful group that had sacked Rome itself in 410 CE, eventually established a kingdom across the peninsula. They were a fascinating bunch. Initially Arian Christians, a different flavour than the Catholic Romans, they eventually converted to Catholicism, uniting the peninsula under a single, if often fractious, monarchy. Their capital moved from Toledo to Seville and back, and they created a surprisingly sophisticated legal code, the Forum Judicum, which would influence Spanish law for centuries. But their kingdom, for all its ambition, was deeply unstable, plagued by dynastic disputes and a powerful, often meddling aristocracy. This internal weakness would prove catastrophic. In 711 CE, a small expeditionary force of Berbers and Arabs, led by a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa. They landed at a rock that would forever bear Tariq's name, Jabal Tariq, or Quote 2, which we know today as Gibraltar. This was not initially intended as a full-scale invasion, but rather a probing raid, perhaps at the invitation of one of the Visigothic factions. Yet, at the Battle of Guadalete, the Visigothic king Roderick was defeated and killed. What followed was an astonishingly rapid conquest. Within a few short years, the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula fell under Muslim control. Cities like Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo, once Roman and then Visigothic strongholds, opened their gates, often with little resistance, sometimes even welcoming the new rulers who promised religious tolerance and lower taxes than the Visigothic lords. This new territory became known as Al-Andalus, and it would quickly become one of the most advanced and vibrant civilizations in the medieval world. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. While the south flourished under the new Islamic Caliphate, a tiny pocket of Christian resistance clung on in the mountainous northern reaches of the peninsula, in a region called Asturias. It was here, in 722 CE, that a Visigothic nobleman named Pelayo supposedly rallied a small force against a much larger Muslim army in a cave at Covadonga. The details are fuzzy, shrouded in legend, but the outcome was undeniable. Pelayo's forces won a minor victory. It was a tiny skirmish in the grand scheme of things, barely a footnote for the mighty Umayyad Caliphate, but for the beleaguered Christians, it was a spark. It was the symbolic beginning of what would become known as the Reconquista, the Quoth-Rios of Iberia, a struggle that would define the peninsula for the next 770 years. While the Christian kingdoms were just beginning their slow, grinding formation in the rugged north, Al-Andalus, particularly under the Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba, was entering a golden age. Imagine Córdoba in the 10th century, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, making it the largest and most sophisticated metropolis in Western Europe. Its streets were paved and lit at night, a luxury unknown in Paris or London at the time. It boasted hundreds of public baths, exquisite gardens, and most famously the Great Mosque, a breathtaking architectural marvel with its forest of striped arches, a place of profound beauty and intellectual activity. Scholars from across the Islamic world, Christians and Jews lived and worked side by side translating ancient Greek texts, pioneering advancements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. They refined agricultural techniques, introducing crops like oranges, rice, and cotton to Europe, and developed sophisticated irrigation systems. This was a place of immense wealth, intellectual curiosity, and cultural synthesis, a beacon of learning that shone brightly while much of Christian Europe was still navigating the so-called quote pop. This vibrant, multi-ethnic society, a stark contrast to the emerging, more insular Christian kingdoms, would profoundly shape the character of Spain. We left the Iberian Peninsula in a state of profound, fascinating contradiction. To the south, a new world was blossoming, Al-Andalus, the jewel of the Islamic West. To the north, a tiny spark of Christian resistance flickered, promising a struggle that would define centuries. Now, let's dive deeper into this crucible, into the centuries that forged the very DNA of what would become the Spanish Empire. Imagine Cordoba in the 10th century. Forget everything you think you know about medieval Europe. This wasn't some muddy, plague-ridden backwater. This was a city of 1 million souls at a time when London was barely 20,000. Its streets were paved and lit. Its houses boasted indoor plumbing and elaborate gardens. We're talking about a metropolis with hundreds of public baths, thousands of mosques, and a library containing hundreds of thousands of volumes when the largest library in Christian Europe could barely boast a few hundred. Walk through its gates and you'd be immersed in a vibrant tapestry of life. Scholars from across the known world flocked here, drawn by the Caliphate's insatiable thirst for knowledge. Arabic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, all were spoken, written, debated. Here, Jewish and Christian scholars, often fluent in Arabic, translated ancient texts, preserving and expanding upon the wisdom of antiquity, while their counterparts in the rest of Europe often struggled to read. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, cartography. The advancements pouring out of Al-Andalus were nothing short of revolutionary. Think algebra, algorithms, advanced surgical tools, the concept of zero, sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed the arid landscape into an agricultural paradise. This wasn't just a place, it was a beacon, radiating intellectual light across a continent often shrouded in darkness. The great mosque of Cordoba, the Mesquita, stands as a testament to this era. Step inside and you're immediately transported. It's a forest of striped arches, a mesmerizing interplay of light and shadow, red brick and white stone, each column a silent witness to 1,000 years of prayer and architectural genius. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was a symbol of power, wealth, and a unique cultural synthesis where Roman, Visigothic, and Islamic influences blended into something entirely new and breathtaking. We see a society that valued beauty, learning, and trade, a truly cosmopolitan hub connected to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, its markets overflowing with silks, spices, and exotic goods. But here's the thing about golden ages. They rarely last forever. Even as Cordoba reached its zenith under the Umayyad Caliphate, the seeds of its eventual fragmentation were already being sown. Internal tensions simmered beneath the surface of this glittering empire. Ethnic rivalries between Arab elites, Berber soldiers, and the Muladi'in, native Iberian converts to Islam, were constant. Dynastic squabbles, palace intrigues, and the rising power of regional governors chipped away at the central authority. By the early 11th century, the magnificent edifice of the Caliphate of Cordoba began to crack. A brutal civil war known as the Fitna tore through Al-Andalus. Cities were sacked, libraries burned, and the political unity shattered. In 1031, the Caliphate officially collapsed, fragmenting into a patchwork of independent, smaller city-states, known as the Taifa kingdoms. Think of them as miniature warring empires, each with its own ruler, its own court, and its own ambitions. Seville, Toledo, Zaragoza, Granada, Valencia, each became a cultural centre in its own right, often vying to outdo the others in artistic patronage and intellectual pursuits. They were beautiful, yes, but also fatally weak. And this weakness, this fragmentation, was precisely the opportunity the Christian kingdoms to the north had been patiently, relentlessly waiting for. While Al-Andalus was experiencing its golden age and subsequent decline into taifas, the Christian north was undergoing its own slow, grinding transformation. From that tiny pocket in Asturias, the Reconquista wasn't a single continuous war, but a centuries-long, often messy, sometimes contradictory expansion. It was a frontier existence, defined by constant skirmishes, shifting alliances, Christians sometimes allied with Muslim taifas against other Christians or Muslims, and the slow, often violent process of repopulating conquered lands. The kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and the nascent Portugal began to emerge. Castile, in particular, would become a driving force, its identity forged on the frontier, its people a hardy, militaristic folk accustomed to hardship and constant struggle. These kingdoms were more insular, yes, but their very struggle imbued them with a fierce sense of identity and a unifying purpose, even amidst their own frequent internal squabbles and rivalries. The cross and the sword became intertwined. Crusading zeal, encouraged by the papacy, provided ideological fuel for their expansion, turning a territorial struggle into a holy war. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The fall of Toledo in 1085. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, a shrewd and ambitious monarch, seized the ancient Visigothic capital. This wasn't just another city. Toledo was a symbolic heartland, a major prize, and its capture sent shockwaves throughout the Taifa kingdoms. It was a clear demonstration that the Christian threat was no longer a distant nuisance, but an existential danger. Desperate, the Taifa kings did something that would dramatically alter the course of the Reconquista. They invited a new power from North Africa to help them. This was the Almoravid dynasty, a fiercely zealous Berber Muslim empire. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, a formidable, disciplined force, and in 1086, at the Battle of Sagrajas, or Zalaca, they delivered a crushing defeat to Alfonso VI, halting the Christian advance cold. The Reconquista was not a one-way street. It was a pendulum, swinging back and forth with brutal intensity. The Almoravids reunified Al-Andalus under a stricter, more orthodox Islamic rule, temporarily restoring a semblance of strength, but at the cost of the earlier, more tolerant cosmopolitanism. But just as the Almoravids had arrived, another even more zealous North African movement, the Almohads, rose to challenge them. By the mid-12th century, the Almohads had swept across North Africa and into Iberia, replacing the Almoravids and once again unifying Al-Andalus, albeit under an even more austere religious doctrine. They too inflicted significant defeats on the Christian kingdoms, demonstrating the enduring resilience of Islamic power in the peninsula. This back and forth, this constant pressure, forced the Christian kingdoms to adapt, to innovate, and crucially to cooperate. Their very survival depended on it, and it culminated in one of the most decisive battles in Iberian history, Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. Imagine this: a grand coalition of Christian armies, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and volunteers from across Europe, facing off against the mighty Almohad forces. It was a clash of titans, a battle that would determine the fate of the peninsula. The Christian victory was absolute and devastating for the Almohads. It wasn't just a battle won, it was a turning point, a psychological blow from which Al-Andalus would never truly recover. After Las Navas de Tolosa, the momentum shifted decisively. The great cities of Al-Andalus began to fall one by one to the Christian kings, Córdoba in 1236, Seville in 1248. the vast majority of the peninsula was now under Christian rule. What remained of Al-Andalus was the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains. This remarkable kingdom, though geographically small, would endure for another 250 years, a testament to its strategic location, its diplomatic skill, often playing Christian kingdoms off against each other, and its enduring cultural brilliance. The Alhambra, that breathtaking palace and fortress, stands today as a poignant reminder of Granada's exquisite artistry and resilience, a last lingering echo of a once vast civilization. Through all this conflict, all this struggle, something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface. The constant interaction, even in war, led to an incredible cultural exchange. We often frame the Reconquista as a clash of civilizations, which it certainly was, but it was also a profound cultural synthesis. Christian scholars flocked to places like the Translation School of Toledo, where they learned Arabic and translated countless works of Islamic science, philosophy, and classical Greek texts that had been lost to the rest of Europe. This influx of knowledge played a crucial role in sparking the European Renaissance. Think about the Spanish language itself, peppered with thousands of Arabic loanwords: azúcar, sugar, aceituna, olive, almohada, pillow, albañil, builder, barrio, neighborhood, naranja, orange. Look at the architecture, the music, the agricultural techniques, the food. The imprint of Al-Andalus is everywhere. The very identity of the emerging Spanish kingdoms was being forged in this crucible of conflict and coexistence. Faith and knowledge, martial prowess and intricate diplomacy. The strength that would one day girdle the earth, the audacious spirit that would launch fleets across uncharted oceans, the fervent faith that would drive conversion and conquest, all of it, every single thread, was being woven in these long turbulent centuries on the Iberian Peninsula. It was a strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle, a relentless drive born of desperation and faith, tempered by the necessity of adapting to and absorbing elements of the very civilization it sought to overcome. The unified global empire that would emerge from this fragmented, embattled land was, to put it mildly, an improbable miracle, and the final pieces of that miracle were about to fall into place. We left the story with the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, a jewel clinging to the southernmost mountains of Iberia, the last defiant ember of Al-Andalus, somehow holding out for another 250 years after the fall of Seville. Think about that for a moment. 2.5 centuries. How did they do it? It's a testament to a few things: the rugged, defensible terrain of the Sierra Nevada, the formidable fortifications of their capital, and, crucially, a shrewd diplomatic game of playing the Christian kingdoms against each other. For generations Granada paid tribute, sometimes to Castile, sometimes to Aragon, acting as a buffer, a prize to be coveted but never quite taken. And what a prize it was! Imagine Granada in the 14th and 15th centuries. It wasn't just a military redoubt, it was a cultural marvel. The Nasrid kings, despite their precarious position, fostered an environment of breathtaking artistic and intellectual achievement. The Alhambra, that sprawling palace-fortress complex, isn't just a building. It's a poem carved in stone and water, a testament to intricate geometry, delicate stucco work and serene courtyards. It was a place where light danced on tiled surfaces, where fountains murmured ancient secrets, where the last vestiges of Al-Andalus's golden age burned with a final exquisite brilliance. If Córdoba was the intellectual heart of earlier Al-Andalus, Granada was its poetic soul, a final poignant flourish before the curtain fell. Meanwhile, to the north, the Christian kingdoms were undergoing their own transformations. The Reconquista had forged them, yes, but it had also left them as distinct, sometimes rivalrous, entities. We had Castile, the largest and most militaristic, a vast central kingdom with its eyes set on expansion, its identity deeply intertwined with the crusading spirit. And then there was Aragon, a kingdom with a different destiny facing the Mediterranean. Aragon was a maritime power, an astute trading empire that had already carved out territories in Sicily, Naples, and even Athens. It was outward-looking, commercially driven, a kingdom of merchants and sailors as much as knights. These were two powerful yet very different entities, and here's where the narrative takes a genuinely fascinating turn, a turn that truly sets the stage for everything that follows, because these two distinct kingdoms, forged in the same crucible of conflict and faith, were about to be united, not by conquest, not by a single dramatic battle, but by something far more subtle and, in its own way, revolutionary for the time: marriage. Enter Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Seriously, if you're looking for a historical power couple, these two are right up there. Isabella, born in 1451, was shrewd, pious, strong-willed, and possessed a remarkable political acumen. She had to fight for her right to the Castilian throne, navigating treacherous court intrigues and even civil war. Ferdinand, born a year later, was equally astute, a brilliant military strategist and a master diplomat. Their marriage in 1469 was not a love match, at least not initially. It was a meticulously calculated political alliance, designed to unite the two most powerful Christian kingdoms of Iberia, and in doing so create a force capable of finally pushing the Reconquista to its conclusion. But here's a crucial point. Their union was initially a personal one, not a full political merger. Castile remained Castile with its own laws, customs and parliament, the courts. Aragon remained Aragon, a confederation of distinct territories, Aragon proper, Catalonia, Valencia and the Balearic Islands, each with its own institutions. They ruled jointly, signing documents as, six. They were, in essence, two strong monarchs governing two distinct kingdoms, but with a shared vision and an undeniable synergy. This duality, this complex tapestry of united yet separate entities, would be part of Spain's identity for centuries. Together, they were a formidable force, and their shared vision extended beyond just their respective kingdoms. They saw themselves as the Catholic monarchs, a title bestowed upon them by the Pope, reflecting their profound religious conviction and their determination to consolidate Christian rule and religious uniformity across the peninsula. This wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about faith, about identity, about forging a new, unified Christian Spain. And so, their attention turned inevitably to Granada. The final act of the Reconquista was about to begin. The War of Granada, which raged from 1482 to 1492, wasn't a series of isolated skirmishes. It was a systematic grinding campaign, a testament to the combined might and strategic brilliance of Ferdinand and Isabella. This wasn't the hit-and-run warfare of earlier centuries. This was a modern war for its time, employing new technologies like heavy artillery, which proved devastating against Granada's ancient fortifications. Imagine the spectacle: a vast, unified Christian army, meticulously supplied and organized, slowly but relentlessly encircling and conquering the last Muslim strongholds. City by city, castle by castle, the Nasrid kingdom was squeezed. The Granadans, led by their last sultan Boabdil, fought bravely, but they were ultimately outmatched. The Christian forces, bolstered by a fervent religious zeal and the combined resources of Castile and Aragon, were simply too powerful. Finally, after a long and arduous siege, Granada, the last bastion of Al-Andalus, surrendered on January 2nd, 1492. The moment was profoundly symbolic. Ferdinand and Isabella rode into the city, and the banner of Castile was raised over the Alhambra. 8 centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula had come to an end. The reconquista was complete. We had achieved, or so it seemed, a unified Spain, forged in the fires of a centuries-long struggle, defined by a fierce Catholic identity and an expansionist drive. But the end of the Reconquista wasn't just about military victory. It was also about defining the future identity of this nascent Spain. Just a few months after Granada's fall, in March of 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from their kingdoms unless they converted to Christianity. Many chose exile, leaving behind centuries of history and contributions to Iberian society. Later, under immense pressure, the remaining Muslim population would also be forced to convert or leave, creating the Morisco population, whose struggles would define much of the next century. This push for religious uniformity, for a singular Catholic identity, would become a defining characteristic of the Spanish state and indeed the Spanish Empire. It was a powerful, often brutal expression of the DNA forged in the crucible of the Reconquista. Now, hold on to that date, 1492. It's not just the year Granada fell and the Jews were expelled. It's also the year of another event, one that would utterly redefine the course of human history and launch this newly unified, fiercely Catholic and expansionist Spain onto a stage far grander than anyone could have imagined. Because you see, while Ferdinand and Isabella were busy consolidating their power and finishing the Reconquista, a certain Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus had been knocking on doors across Europe for years, pitching an audacious, almost lunatic idea to reach the east by sailing west. Portugal, the dominant maritime power of the era, had already dismissed him, preferring their established routes around Africa. England and France weren't interested. Spain, fresh from its monumental victory, might have seemed like an unlikely patron. But Isabella, ever the visionary, saw something in Columbus's proposal. Perhaps it was the promise of wealth to fund her newly unified kingdom. Perhaps the allure of spreading Christianity to new lands. Or perhaps simply the sheer audacity of the idea appealed to her own ambitious spirit. Whatever the reason, after years of rejection, Columbus finally secured the backing of the Catholic monarchs. Imagine the scene: a kingdom, fresh from centuries of internal struggle, now turning its gaze outward, not just to the traditional European rivals, but to the vast unknown expanse of the Atlantic. It was a leap of faith, an almost incomprehensible gamble. On August 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus, with 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria set sail from Palos de la Frontera. We all know what happened next. After weeks of terrifying uncertainty, on October the 12th, 1492, land was sighted. Columbus had not reached the Indies as he believed, but a new, unknown continent. The quote 10 of the Americas was not just an event, it was an explosion. It fundamentally altered the global map, shattered existing paradigms, and unleashed a torrent of exploration, conquest, and cultural exchange that would reshape the world forever. Here's the profound connection. The relentless drive, the unwavering faith, the willingness to take immense risks, the expansionist ambition, all the qualities forged in those nearly 800 years of reconquista, now had a new, unimaginable outlet. The crucible of Iberia had produced a power uniquely suited for global expansion. The DNA of the Spanish Empire, forged in conflict and aspiration, was about to express itself on a scale that would literally gird the earth. The year 1492 isn't just a date, it's a pivot point. The end of one epic struggle and the beginning of another, even grander, audacious adventure. The Spanish Empire, an improbable entity born of a fragmented peninsula, was no longer just a glimmer in anyone's eye. It was taking its first staggering steps onto the world stage, about to become the first truly global power the world had ever seen. What would this newfound power do with its unprecedented opportunity? That, my friends, is where our story truly begins to unfold. The last chapter ended with an almost unbelievable pivot. One moment, Spain was finishing an 800-year struggle on its own soil. The next, it was launching itself across an unknown ocean. On August 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus, a Genoese mariner with an audacious proposition, set sail from Palos de la Frontera, his 3 caravels, the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria, tiny specks against the vast, terrifying expanse of the Atlantic. His goal, as we know, wasn't to discover a new continent. No, he was looking for a westward route to the riches of Asia, a shortcut to the spices and silks of the East that Portugal was painstakingly navigating around Africa. And then, on October 12th, 1492, after weeks of anxious sailing and mounting tension among his crew, a lookout on the Pinta spotted land. Can you imagine that moment? The sheer, unadulterated relief, the dawning realization that they hadn't simply sailed off the edge of the world, they had found something. Columbus, believing he had reached the East Indies, named the indigenous inhabitants he encountered Indians. He landed on an island in the Bahamas, which the native Taino people called Guanahani, and Columbus promptly rechristened San Salvador, Holy Saviour. This wasn't China, it wasn't Japan, it certainly wasn't the Spice Islands of Indonesia, but it was something, and what a something it was. What Columbus stumbled upon was a world utterly alien to Europe, teeming with diverse cultures, languages, and ecosystems. It was, in a very real sense, a new world, completely disconnected from the Afro-Eurasian landmass that had shaped human history for millennia. For the Spanish, this discovery was less about exploration and more about immediate opportunity. Columbus, ever the astute observer of potential resources, noted the quote 12, but, crucially, also observed the gold ornaments worn by the Taino. Gold. That single word, gleaming with the promise of unimaginable wealth, would become the driving force of the next century. Columbus made 4 voyages in total, exploring much of the Caribbean, establishing the first permanent European settlement in the Americas on Hispaniola, La Isabela, later Santo Domingo, and ceaselessly searching for the fabled passage to Asia. He died believing he had reached the outskirts of the Orient, but the world had already irrevocably changed. The quote 13 immediately sparked a global scramble. Portugal, a maritime power with its own burgeoning empire in Africa and Asia, cried foul. They had their own claims, backed by papal bulls dating back decades, granting them exclusive rights to land south and east. Here's where we see the immense, almost arrogant confidence of the Spanish crown, fresh off the Reconquista. They appealed to the Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard I might add, who, in a series of papal bulls culminating in Inter Caetera, 1493, essentially drew a line down the Atlantic, granting Spain rights to all lands west of it. Portugal naturally wasn't thrilled. Imagine being told that half the world was yours, but only if you could get there first. This led to one of the most audacious diplomatic acts in history, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Spain and Portugal, two relatively small nations on the western edge of Europe, literally sat down and divided the entire non-European world between them. They moved the papal line further west, granting Portugal a slice of South America, which, as we know, would become Brazil, and solidifying Spain's claim to the vast majority of the Americas. It's a staggering display of imperial ambition, a cartographic carve-up of lands they had barely even seen, let alone understood. Now let's talk about those first Spanish steps in the New World. Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic became the crucible. The Spanish arrived with a mindset honed by centuries of warfare against Muslims: conquer, convert, settle, exploit. The Taino, a peaceful agricultural people, were ill-equipped to resist. The Spanish, desperate for gold, quickly imposed a brutal system of forced labour known as the encomienda. This system, ostensibly designed to protect and Christianize indigenous populations, was in practice little more than slavery. Indigenous people were entrusted to Spanish settlers, encomenderos, who were supposed to instruct them in the Christian faith, but instead worked them to death in mines and plantations. The consequences were catastrophic. Within decades, the Taino population of Hispaniola, estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, at the time of Columbus's arrival, was decimated. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which the indigenous peoples had no immunity, played an even more devastating role than direct violence and forced labour. It's a truly heartbreaking chapter, a stark reminder of the immense human cost of conquest. We're talking about a demographic collapse of unimaginable scale, a silent genocide driven by disease and exploitation. But the Spanish push wasn't just about gold, it was also about glory and God. The same fervent Catholic zeal that drove the Reconquista was now directed across the ocean. Every act of conquest was justified by the spread of Christianity. Before engaging in battle, conquistadors would often read the Requerimiento, a Spanish document that informed indigenous peoples, in Spanish, which they didn't understand, that they were subjects of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church, and that if they resisted, their enslavement and death would be their own fault. It's a chilling example of legalistic self-justification, a veneer of legitimacy over profound violence. This early period in the Caribbean, from roughly 1492 to the 1510s, was characterized by brutal experimentation, The Spanish were learning how to colonize, how to exploit, and how to survive in an alien environment. They built towns, established rudimentary governance, and began to understand the sheer scale of the landmass they had stumbled upon. Hispaniola became the launching pad, the base from which further explorations radiated. From Hispaniola, figures like Juan Ponce de Leon ventured north, discovering Florida in 1513, forever associating his name with the search for the Fountain of Youth, but more practically, expanding the Spanish claim. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, another explorer, famously crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, becoming the first European to gaze upon the Pacific Ocean, which he dramatically named the South Sea. Imagine that moment, standing on a mountain ridge, looking out at an ocean so vast, so endless, that it fundamentally altered the European understanding of world geography. Suddenly, the true scale of the Americas and the distance to Asia became terrifyingly clear. These were the conquistadors, men often of limited means, but with boundless ambition, courage, and a ruthlessness forged in the crucible of the reconquista. They were adventurers, soldiers, fortune-seekers, and fervent Catholics all rolled into one. They were driven by the promise of God, gold, and glory, a potent cocktail that propelled them into uncharted territories. They were, in many ways, the spiritual heirs of the knights who had fought against the Moors, now simply with a much larger and more mysterious frontier. The early discoveries in the Caribbean, while rich in gold initially, quickly proved finite. The gold veins ran out, the Taino population dwindled, and the dream of a quick fortune began to fade. This forced the Spanish to look further, to push beyond the islands, driven by rumours, always rumours, of vast wealthy empires on the mainland. The myth of El Dorado, the Golden One, a city of gold, began to take root in the European imagination, a powerful magnet drawing wave after wave of Spanish adventurers deeper into the unknown. The Spanish Empire, then, didn't emerge fully formed. It was a messy, brutal, and often improvised affair in its early stages. It was born from a combination of geopolitical rivalry, religious fervour, and an insatiable hunger for wealth. The lessons learned in the Caribbean, the devastating impact of disease, the effectiveness of superior weaponry and tactics, the brutal efficiency of the encomienda system, and the relentless drive for gold would be applied on an infinitely larger scale to the mainland. We've seen the spark. We've seen the first tentative yet devastating steps. Now, the stage is set for the truly monumental conquest that would define the Spanish Empire for centuries. The islands were merely the antechamber. Beyond lay continents, civilizations, and riches that would utterly transform Spain, Europe, and indeed the entire world. The age of the great mainland conquest was about to begin, an era of unimaginable audacity and unprecedented violence, driven by men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, whose names would become synonymous with the forging of an empire. The story of Spain's improbable rise was just getting started. The Caribbean, for all its initial glitter, was proving to be a finite well. The gold, once so tantalizing, was quickly extracted, leaving behind devastated islands and a lingering sense of unfulfilled promise. But the whispers, oh, the whispers, they drifted across the turquoise waters, carried on the trade winds, tales of something far grander, far richer than anything seen on Hispaniola or Cuba. Stories of vast empires cities of gold, and civilizations that dwarfed anything Europe had to offer. And so the Spanish gaze, ever hungry, ever ambitious, turned westward once more, fixed on the mainland. This wasn't merely a shift in geography, it was a fundamental reorientation of destiny. We're about to witness one of the most audacious, brutal, and utterly improbable conquests in human history. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer audacity of it. A handful of men armed with steel, gunpowder, and an unshakable belief in their divine right, sailing into the unknown to confront empires of millions. It's the kind of story that stretches the limits of belief, a testament to a particular brand of Spanish resolve forged in the fires of the Reconquista. Among these men, one figure stands out, a man whose name would become synonymous with ruthless ambition and strategic brilliance, Hernán Cortés. Born in Medellin, Spain, a minor nobleman, Cortés had already cut his teeth in the Caribbean, participating in the conquest of Cuba. He was a product of his time, steeped in the martial traditions of a newly unified Spain, driven by the familiar trinity: God, gold, and glory. But Cortés possessed something more: a cunning intellect, a charisma that could sway men, and a gambler's nerve that would see him risk everything on a single, impossible venture. In 1519, Cortés, defying the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, set sail for the Yucatan Peninsula with a mere 11 ships, about 500 soldiers, a handful of cannons, and 16 horses. 16 horses! Think about that. To challenge an empire that commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, it sounds like a suicide mission, doesn't it? And in many ways, it was. But Cortés understood something fundamental about power, about perception, and about exploiting weakness. Now, let's talk about the empire he was about to confront, the Mexica, better known as the Aztec Empire. This wasn't some scattered collection of tribes. This was a sophisticated, dominant power that held sway over vast swathes of Mesoamerica, its influence stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, it was a city of canals, causeways, towering temples, and bustling markets, home to perhaps 200,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at the time. Imagine Venice, but on a scale that would make your jaw drop, nestled in a high-altitude basin surrounded by snow-capped volcanoes. The Aztecs were engineers, astronomers, poets, and warriors. Their society was complex, hierarchical, and deeply religious, centered around a pantheon of gods who demanded tribute, often in the form of human sacrifice. This practice, horrifying to European sensibilities, would become a powerful propaganda tool for the Spanish, justifying their brutal conquest as a divine mission to end barbarism. Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Veracruz. His first act of unparalleled audacity, to scuttle his own ships. Not all of them, but enough to send an unmistakable message. There was no retreat. It was conquest or death. This move cemented his authority over his men, eliminating any thought of turning back. It was a brilliant, terrifying psychological maneuver. "We are here to stay," he effectively declared, "and we will conquer." As they began their march inland, the Spanish encountered various indigenous groups. Some resisted fiercely, others were curious, and many were deeply resentful of Aztec dominance. This is where Cortés's strategic genius truly shone. He wasn't just a brute, he was a master manipulator. He quickly learned of the deep-seated animosities that simmered beneath the surface of the Aztec Empire. Many tributary states chafed under the heavy hand of Tenochtitlan, especially the demand for tribute and sacrificial victims. Foremost among these were the Tlaxcalans, a fierce warrior people who had successfully resisted Aztec conquest for decades. Initially, they fought the Spanish, testing their mettle, but after a series of brutal skirmishes and witnessing the devastating power of Spanish steel, cannons, and those terrifying deer, horses, that seemed like mythical beasts, the Tlaxcalans made a fateful decision. They formed an alliance with Cortés, seeing him not as a conqueror but as a liberator, a powerful new ally against their ancient enemy. This alliance was absolutely crucial. Without indigenous allies, the conquest of Mexico would have been impossible. The Spanish were few, their allies were many. They provided intelligence, supplies, and most importantly, tens of thousands of warriors who knew the terrain, understood the local politics, and harbored generations of hatred for the Aztecs. It's a critical nuance often overlooked. The Spanish didn't conquer the Aztec Empire alone. They did it with the help of other indigenous peoples. As Cortés and his growing army of Spanish and Tlaxcalan warriors approached Tenochtitlan, word of their coming preceded them. The Aztec Huitlatoani, or Emperor Moctezuma II, was in a quandary. He had received omens, portents of doom, for years. The arrival of these strange bearded men, clad in shining armour, riding beasts and wielding thunderous weapons, seemed to fulfill ancient prophecies. Was Cortés the returning god Quetzalcoatl, as some believed? Moctezuma, a devout man, was paralysed by indecision and a deep sense of dread. He sent gifts, lavish offerings of gold and precious feathers, hoping to appease these newcomers and convince them to turn back. But to the Spanish, these gifts had the opposite effect. They were not deterrents. They were proof. Proof of the unimaginable wealth that lay within Tenochtitlan, fueling their greed and cementing their resolve. In November 1519, Cortés and his small band of conquistadors, accompanied by thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, marched across the causeways into Tenochtitlan. We can only imagine the scene. The dazzling white plaster of the temples, the vibrant colours of the markets, the sheer scale of the city rising from the lake. It must have been a sight of breathtaking wonder for the Europeans, a civilization utterly unlike anything they had ever conceived. And for the Aztecs, the sight of these strange men, their faces hidden behind metal, their movements precise and alien, must have been equally confounding. Moctezuma, in an act of extraordinary diplomacy, or perhaps fatalistic resignation, welcomed Cortés into the city, housing him and his men in a grand palace. This was a monumental miscalculation. Cortés, ever the opportunist, soon took Moctezuma captive within his own palace, ruling through him, effectively seizing control of the empire from the inside. For several months the Spanish lived precariously within Tenochtitlan, their presence a constant source of tension. Then a crisis erupted. While Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish expedition sent by Velázquez to arrest him, which he brilliantly co-opted, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado panicked during an Aztec religious festival. Fearing an uprising, he ordered a massacre of unarmed Aztec nobles and priests. This horrific act ignited the city. The Aztecs rose up in fury, besieging the Spanish in their palace. Cortés rushed back to Tenochtitlan, fighting his way through the enraged populace. The situation was desperate. Moctezuma, attempting to calm his people, was either killed by his own subjects for collaborating with the Spanish or murdered by the Spanish themselves. The accounts differ. What is clear is that the bond of trust, however fragile, was irrevocably broken. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a night forever etched into Spanish history as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, Cortés and his men attempted a desperate escape under the cover of darkness. Laden with stolen gold, they tried to slip across the causeways, but they were discovered. The Aztecs swarmed them from canoes and the causeways, unleashing a ferocious assault. Many Spanish drowned, weighed down by their armour and loot. Hundreds were killed, sacrificed to Aztec gods. It was a devastating defeat, a bloody testament to the power and fury of the Aztec people. Cortés, weeping under a tree after his escape, had lost most of his men and nearly all his equipment. Any other commander might have given up, but not Cortés. He regrouped, reinforced by his Tlaxcalan allies who remained loyal despite the setback, and crucially by a new unseen ally, smallpox. The disease, carried by a single African slave in Cortés's original expedition, had been silently ravaging the indigenous population. Having no immunity to European diseases, the Aztecs were decimated. By the time Cortés returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan in May 1521, the city was already weakened, its population ravaged by illness, its leadership fractured. The siege was brutal and protracted. For 93 days, the Spanish and their indigenous allies blockaded the city, cut off its food and water supply, and fought house by house, temple by temple. Cortés deployed brigantines, small sailing ships, on the lake, giving him control of the waterways. The fighting was savage, marked by incredible bravery on both sides. But in the end, disease, starvation, superior Spanish weaponry, and the overwhelming numbers of indigenous allies proved decisive. On August 13th, 1521, the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured, and Tenochtitlan fell. The magnificent city was utterly destroyed, its temples razed, its canals filled with rubble and bodies. On its ruins, the Spanish would build their own capital, Mexico City, the heart of what would become the viceroyalty of New Spain. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was a watershed moment. It was a victory of improbable scale, achieved by a tiny European force leveraging indigenous divisions and, unknowingly, the devastating power of disease. The gold, silver, and other riches extracted from Mexico began to flow across the Atlantic, transforming Spain into the wealthiest nation in Europe. It was a validation of the God, Gold, and Glory mantra, demonstrating that vast wealth and power could be seized in this new world. But the cost was immense. An ancient civilization, vibrant and complex, was shattered. Its people were subjected to foreign rule, forced labour, and conversion. The discovery of the New World had quickly become its brutal subjugation. Cortés had shown the way. He had demonstrated that vast, powerful empires could be toppled. His conquest, audacious as it was, ignited a feverish scramble for more. Rumours of another, even richer empire far to the south began to circulate. An empire nestled high in the Andes, brimming with gold and silver, beckoned. The stage was set for the next, equally improbable act of conquest, one that would redefine the very meaning of wealth and power for the Spanish Empire. The dust had barely settled in Tenochtitlan, the last echoes of the brutal siege still ringing across the newly christened Mexico City when the whispers began. Whispers of a land even richer, a civilization even more dazzling, high in the distant mountains to the south. We're talking about an empire whose wealth, according to the fervent accounts, dwarfed even the fabled treasures of the Aztecs. For the Spanish, fresh off their improbable conquest of Mesoamerica, this wasn't just a rumour, it was a siren song, a divine promise, a call to even greater glory and, more importantly, to even more gold. Remember that relentless drive we talked about? That insatiable hunger forged in the crucible of 8 centuries of reconquista. It wasn't sated by the Aztec gold. Far from it. It was merely sharpened, honed to an even finer edge. The Spanish appetite for the precious metals that fueled their dreams of global dominance was boundless. And so, their gaze, ever westward and now southward, fell upon the Andean peaks. But who would lead this next, even more audacious gamble? Who possessed the unique blend of ruthlessness, resilience, and sheer, bloody-minded determination required to tackle an empire rumoured to be vaster and more formidable than any yet encountered? Enter Francisco Pizarro. Now, if Hernán Cortés was the charismatic, educated hidalgo who could charm and strategize with equal measure, Pizarro was his stark opposite. Born in Trujillo, Spain, an illegitimate child, he was illiterate, hardened by years as a swineherd before escaping that meagre existence for the New World. He arrived in Hispaniola in 1502, just as the first wave of conquest was truly getting underway. He spent years in the Caribbean crucible, a veteran of countless skirmishes, an explorer alongside Vasco Núñez de Balboa when the Pacific Ocean was first discovered by Europeans. He was a man of action, not words, with a face carved by sun and hardship, and eyes that held the glint of unyielding ambition. He had seen fortunes made and lost, had endured brutal campaigns, and yet by his late 40s he was still a relatively poor man. This gnawing lack of significant wealth, despite decades in the Americas, fueled a desperation that would define his greatest undertaking. Pizarro had heard the same rumours as everyone else, tales of Peru, a land of gold far to the south. He partnered with a priest, Hernando de Luque, and a soldier, Diego de Almagro, forming a triumvirate of ambition. Their early expeditions down the Pacific coast of South America were disastrous. They faced impenetrable jungles, hostile natives, disease and starvation. We're talking about suffering on a scale that would break lesser men. On one infamous occasion, with his men on the brink of mutiny, Pizarro drew a line in the sand on a desolate island beach, challenging those who wished to return to Panama to cross it. 13 men, the famous 13, chose to stay, a testament to their loyalty or perhaps their shared desperate belief in the impossible. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulates the Spanish imperial project. An audacious few, against all odds, driven by a vision of unimaginable riches. Recognizing the need for official royal backing, Pizarro returned to Spain in 1528. He presented his findings, the gold artifacts, the llamas, the stories, to Emperor Charles V, who, remember, now held the crowns of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and vast territories across Europe. Charles, ever keen on expanding his coffers, granted Pizarro a capitulation, naming him Governor and Captain General of New Castile, as Peru would be called, and bestowing upon him immense power, but giving his partner Almagro a lesser title. This sowed the seeds of a bitter rivalry that would later explode into civil war among the conquerors themselves. Pizarro returned to the New World, bringing with him his 4 half-brothers, all eager for a share of the rumoured riches. His force was tiny, even by the standards of the time, fewer than 200 men, a handful of cannons, and about 24 horses. To understand the sheer audacity of this, we need to understand the empire they were about to confront. Imagine, if you will, the Inca Empire. This wasn't a loose confederation of city-states like the Aztecs. This was a true empire, a monumental achievement of social engineering and administration, stretching for over 2,500 miles along the spine of the Andes Mountains, from modern-day Colombia down to Chile. Its capital, Cusco, nestled high in the mountains, was a city of breathtaking stone architecture, intricate goldwork, and a sophisticated system of social organization. The Incas had no written language, but they communicated across their vast domain using a complex system of knotted cords called quipu. They lacked the wheel, but built an astonishing network of paved roads, suspension bridges, and relay stations that rivaled Rome's, allowing messages and goods to travel with incredible speed across challenging terrain. Their agricultural terraces, carved into steep mountainsides, were engineering marvels, feeding millions. They extracted immense wealth from their lands, particularly gold and silver, which they prized for its aesthetic and religious value, not as currency. They viewed gold as the sweat of the sun and silver as the tears of the moon, crafting exquisite ornaments and religious items. And here's the critical, fatal flaw, the crack in the edifice that Pizarro, like Cortés before him, would exploit with ruthless efficiency. The Inca Empire was in the midst of a devastating civil war. Just before the Spanish arrived, the great Inca, Huayna Capac, and his chosen heir died, likely from smallpox, that invisible ally of the conquistadors, already spreading ahead of them. This left 2 of his sons, Huasca and Atahualpa, locked in a brutal struggle for the throne. Atahualpa, the victor, had only recently crushed Huasca's forces and was consolidating his power, encamped with his victorious army of tens of thousands at Cajamarca, a royal resort in the northern highlands. This was the situation Pizarro sailed into in 1532. He landed in what is now northern Peru, near the city of Tumbes, his tiny force dwarfed by the landscape and the rumoured power of the Inca. His march inland was another epic of endurance, a winding ascent through the precipitous mountain passes, with every step a gamble. He sent envoys to Atahualpa, feigning friendship, inviting him to a meeting. Atahualpa, confident in his overwhelming numbers, curious about these strange bearded men, and perhaps underestimating their intentions, agreed. He saw them as a minor nuisance, perhaps even potential mercenaries, certainly not a threat to his newly unified empire. Pizarro, however, saw his opportunity. He led his men, a mere 168 of them, into the mountain town of Cajamarca. It was late afternoon, November 16th, 1532. The Spanish positioned themselves in the central plaza, hiding their cannons and horses in the surrounding buildings. They waited. Then the Inca arrived. Atahualpa entered the plaza on a magnificent litter, adorned with gold and silver, carried by 80 nobles, followed by thousands of his warriors and retainers. It was a spectacle of imperial power, a dazzling display of wealth and confidence. But there was a critical oversight. Atahualpa, in a gesture of peace and trust, had ordered his warriors to leave their weapons outside the plaza. He entered, unarmed, into a trap. Friar Vicente de Valverde, the Spanish chaplain, stepped forward, carrying a cross and a breviary. He began to read the requerimiento, the absurd legalistic document we've encountered before, demanding that Atahualpa accept Christianity and the authority of the Spanish king. Atahualpa, relying on an interpreter who likely mangled the complex theological and legal concepts, was utterly bewildered. He asked to see the source of the friar's authority, indicating the breviary. He took the book, examined it, and hearing no words from it, threw it to the ground in disgust. That was the signal. "Santiago!" cried the Spanish. "Charge!" From every hidden corner the Spanish burst forth. Cannons roared, muskets cracked, and the terrifying sound of horses, creatures unknown to the Incas, thundered into the plaza. The Inca retinue, unarmed and packed tightly, became a slaughter pen. Panic erupted. Nobles carrying Atahualpa's litter were cut down, one after another, as the Spanish desperately tried to get to the Inca emperor. Atahualpa himself was eventually pulled from his litter, captured alive by Pizarro himself, who reportedly shielded him from a Spanish sword. The massacre that followed was swift and brutal. Thousands of Incas died in the plaza, crushed in the stampede or cut down by Spanish steel. Not a single Spaniard was killed. The psychological shock was absolute. The divine Inca, son of the sun, had been captured, his army routed by these strange, terrifying foreigners. The very fabric of their cosmos was torn apart. Atahualpa, a prisoner, quickly grasped the Spanish obsession. He offered a ransom, a room 22 feet long by 17 feet wide, filled once with gold and twice with silver, stacked as high as he could reach. It was an astonishing offer, a sum of wealth almost beyond comprehension, even for the Spanish. Pizarro agreed. For months the gold and silver poured into Cajamarca from every corner of the vast Inca empire. Temples were stripped, ornaments melted down. We can only imagine the cultural devastation, the irreplaceable artistry reduced to ingots. It was an unprecedented transfer of wealth, a literal mountain of precious metals, worth hundreds of millions in today's currency. But even after the room was filled, even after the ransom was paid, Pizarro had no intention of releasing Atahualpa. The Inca emperor represented a living symbol of resistance, a rallying point for his people. On July 26, 1533, after a sham trial where he was accused of idolatry, polygamy and rebellion, Atahualpa was garroted. He was offered a quick death by strangulation if he converted to Christianity, which he did, taking the name Francisco. With Atahualpa dead, the Inca Empire, already fractured by civil war, truly began to unravel. Pizarro marched on to Cusco, the capital, installing a puppet Inca, Manco Inca, but the real power was now Spanish. The conquest of the Inca Empire was largely complete within a few short years, though pockets of resistance would persist for decades, notably in the remote jungle kingdom of Vilcabamba. What we see here is a terrifying echo of the Aztec conquest, yet on an even grander scale. The same ingredients were present: a small, audacious Spanish force, technological superiority, steel, gunpowder, horses, the devastating impact of European diseases, and most crucially, the exploitation of pre-existing internal divisions. The Inca Civil War was Pizarro's Tlaxcalans, a crack in an otherwise impenetrable fortress. The wealth now flowing into Spain from both Mexico and Peru was staggering, transforming the nation into the richest and most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But this era of unparalleled imperial expansion and immense treasure would also bring with it new challenges, new conflicts, and a legacy that would forever shape the course of global history. The DNA of the reconquista, that relentless drive, that fanatical faith, that unyielding ambition, had now girdled half the earth. The Inca Empire, a civilization that had stretched for thousands of miles along the spine of the Andes, was shattered. Its gold, its silver, its very essence was now being systematically stripped away. Pizarro, a man who had been nothing just a few years before, now commanded unfathomable wealth. He had his ransom, and then some. But the story, as we've seen so many times, never really ends with the immediate spoils. It only expands. Imagine, if you will, the sheer volume of precious metals now beginning its journey across the Atlantic. We're talking about tons upon tons of gold and silver melted down from intricate artworks, religious artifacts, and raw ore. This wasn't just a trickle, it was a flood. And this flood, this torrent of wealth, was about to fundamentally reshape not just Spain, but the entire world. The Caribbean had been a proving ground, a brutal laboratory for the encomienda system, and a tragic testament to the devastating power of disease. Mexico, with its vast native populations, saw this system expand, adapted to a much larger scale. Now, in Peru, the same patterns began to replicate themselves, often with even greater ferocity due to the sheer mineral riches hidden within the mountains. The Spanish established new cities, laid out in grid patterns over the ashes of indigenous settlements, and began to impose their language, their laws, and their faith. The Church, ever present, followed the conquistadors, eager to convert souls, sometimes with genuine zeal, sometimes with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other. But as impressive as these individual conquests were, as audacious as Cortés and Pizarro had been, they were merely the cutting edge of a much larger, much more complex and, frankly, much more improbable entity, the Spanish Empire. And at the head of this burgeoning behemoth was a man who, by the sheer accident of birth and a series of strategic marriages, found himself the most powerful ruler in Europe, if not the world. Let's talk about Charles V. We've seen Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, lay the foundations. Their daughter, Joanna the Mad, married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince. Their son was Charles. And what an inheritance this young man received. When we talk about a global empire, Charles V is really where it starts to get genuinely interesting. Think about it. From his maternal grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, Charles inherited the unified kingdoms of Castile and Aragon with their respective crowns, and critically, all of the nascent Spanish-American Empire, Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean, and all the lands yet to be discovered and claimed. Then, from his paternal grandparents, the Habsburgs and Burgundians, he inherited the Netherlands, Franche-Comté, Austria, and the claim to the Holy Roman Empire. Seriously, take a moment to visualize that. Here's a young man, born in Ghent in 1500, who by his mid-20s controlled a territory so vast that it truly was said the sun never set on his dominions. He was King of Spain, as Carlos I, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, King of Naples, Sicily and Sardinia, and, most prestigious of all, Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't just a collection of lands, It was a patchwork quilt of cultures, languages, and political traditions, all bound together by one man's crown. What makes no sense, what's truly mind-boggling, is how anyone could manage such an empire, especially in the 16th century with slow communication and constant threats. Charles V faced challenges on every conceivable front, challenges that would have crushed a lesser man. His reign, from 1516 to 1556, was a relentless, exhausting 4-decade-long struggle. First, and perhaps most existentially for a devout Catholic ruler like Charles, was the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. What started as an academic debate quickly spiraled into a full-blown religious schism, tearing apart the spiritual fabric of Europe. For Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, defender of the Catholic faith, this was an internal rebellion of monumental proportions. He spent years trying to suppress it, fighting princes and theologians, but the genie was out of the bottle. The unity of Christendom, a core tenet of his imperial vision, was gone forever. Then there was France. For centuries, the Habsburgs and the French Valois dynasty had been bitter rivals, and Charles V's reign was no exception. Francis I of France, a contemporary and equally ambitious monarch, saw Charles's sprawling empire as a threat to French dominance and security. They fought a series of brutal, expensive wars, primarily over control of Italy, which was then a collection of wealthy, strategically important city-states. These were personal rivalries, dynastic struggles, and geopolitical chess matches played out with armies and cannons, and as if internal religious upheaval and external European rivals weren't enough, Charles V faced a third, incredibly potent threat from the East, the Ottoman Empire. Under the brilliant leadership of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans were at the zenith of their power. They pushed deep into Eastern Europe, besieging Vienna in 1529, and their powerful navy dominated the Mediterranean, constantly raiding Spanish and Italian coasts and threatening trade routes. Charles found himself fighting a multi-front war, a literal encirclement by enemies, from the freezing plains of Germany to the sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean. How did he pay for all of this? How did he maintain vast armies, build navies, and fund countless diplomatic missions across such an immense and fragmented territory? Here's where the Americas, and specifically one particular mountain in the Andes, enters the story with dramatic force. In 1545, just 13 years after Pizarro's conquest of the Inca, a truly astonishing discovery was made in what is now Bolivia. A local indigenous man, searching for a lost llama, stumbled upon a massive vein of silver ore. This wasn't just a silver mine, this was the silver mine. It was Potosi. Imagine a mountain, Cerro Rico, or, quote 30 literally shimmering with silver. It wasn't just a deposit, it was a geological anomaly, a colossal treasure chest that seemed to defy belief. The Spanish quickly moved in, establishing a sprawling, chaotic city at its base, one of the largest in the world at the time, despite its brutal altitude, over 13,000 feet. And here, the brutal colonial system found its most devastating expression. To extract this silver, the Spanish revived and intensified an existing Inca labor system called the mita. Indigenous men, often from hundreds of miles away, were forcibly conscripted to work in the dark, cold, oxygen-thin tunnels of Potosi, The conditions were horrific: collapses, mercury poisoning from the refining process, exhaustion, starvation, and disease. It was quite simply a death sentence for countless thousands. But the silver flowed, an unprecedented amount of silver. It was minted into coins, the famous pieces of 8, and loaded onto fleets of galleons that sailed from Veracruz and Cartagena to Seville. This silver became the lifeblood of Charles V's empire. It financed his wars against France, funded his campaigns against the Ottomans, and propped up his vast, sprawling administration. It was the material foundation of Spain's imperial golden age, and the very currency that would, for a time, girdle the earth. However, this influx of wealth wasn't without its downsides. While Spain grew immensely rich, the sheer volume of silver also led to massive inflation, a phenomenon economists call the rare quote 35. Prices for goods and services skyrocketed across Europe, particularly in Spain, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary people and making Spanish products less competitive. The empire became dependent on this silver, and its economy, rather than developing diverse industries, became increasingly focused on extracting and transporting it. After 4 decades of relentless struggle, of constantly moving between his various kingdoms, fighting his various enemies, and trying to hold together his impossibly vast empire, Charles V was exhausted. He was also a deeply religious man who felt he had failed to contain the Reformation. In 1556, in a move that shocked Europe, he abdicated. He divided his empire. The Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian Habsburg lands went to his brother, Ferdinand. And the core of what we consider the Spanish Empire, Spain itself, the Netherlands, and all the American territories along with the Italian possessions, went to his son, Philip II. It was a momentous transfer of power, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Charles V, the last truly universal emperor of the West, retired to a monastery, leaving his son to inherit not just the largest empire the world had ever seen, but also its immense challenges and its incredible promise. The struggle for global dominance, fueled by American silver and Spanish ambition, was just getting started. Charles V, that peripatetic emperor who spent his life traversing the vast, fragmented dominion he'd inherited, finally laid down his burdens in 1556. Exhausted, ravaged by gout, and weary of the endless wars and religious schisms that defined his reign, he famously divided his empire. To his brother Ferdinand went the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg lands in Central Europe, but to his son, Philip II, went the heart of the beast, Spain, its colossal American empire, the Netherlands, Franche-Comté, Sicily, Naples, Milan, and the Spanish possessions in North Africa. Imagine, if you will, the weight of that inheritance. It was a staggering collection of territories, a truly global empire that stretched from the silver mines of Potosi to the bustling ports of Antwerp, from the sun-drenched plains of Castile to the distant islands of the Philippines. It was a realm upon which, as the saying would soon go, the sun literally never set. And at its helm now stood Philip II, a man utterly different from his globe-trotting father. Where Charles V was a weary warrior, always on the move, Philip II was a meticulous administrator, a devout Catholic, and a quintessential Spaniard. He spoke Castilian as his primary language, not the Flemish or German of his father. He was a man of the desk, of the council chamber of the monastery. His vision for governing this sprawling, bewildering empire was revolutionary: centralize, systematize, and govern it all from one place. And that place, he decided, would be Madrid. Until Philip, Madrid had been little more than a dusty Castilian town, but he made it his capital, and from there he embarked on one of the most ambitious building projects in European history, El Escorial. This wasn't just a palace, it was a monastery, a royal pantheon, a library, and the nerve centre of the most powerful empire the world had yet seen. Its austere granite walls, massive and imposing, perfectly reflected Philip's own personality: disciplined, serious, and utterly devoted to God and crown. From El Escorial's Spartan chambers, Philip, the paper king, would pore over endless dispatches, making decisions that reverberated across oceans and continents. He literally attempted to micromanage a global empire from a single, isolated desk. It's an astonishing feat of bureaucratic ambition, isn't it? But what fueled this unprecedented administrative machine? What paid for the endless wars, the vast bureaucracy, the construction of monumental palaces and churches? The answer, as we've seen, lay across the Atlantic: American silver. The treasure fleets laden with Potosi's bounty continued to flow into Seville, transforming Spain into Europe's wealthiest nation. This silver was the lifeblood of Philip's empire, financing his armies, his navies, and his grand geopolitical ambitions. However, this immense influx of wealth was a double-edged sword. While it brought power and prestige, it also created massive inflation across Europe, a phenomenon known as the quote 37 quote. More critically for Spain, it discouraged domestic industry. Why bother producing goods when you could simply buy them with American silver? The long-term consequence was an economy dangerously reliant on colonial extraction, rather than sustainable internal development. The seeds of future decline were, paradoxically, sown in the very wealth that made Spain so dominant, and dominate it did. Philip II's reign was a constant, relentless struggle to maintain and expand Spanish power, often driven by his fervent Catholic faith. The Sesquote 38 of the Reconquista, that centuries-long struggle against Islam, was very much alive in Philip's foreign policy, extending far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The most immediate and enduring threat in the Mediterranean was the Ottoman Empire. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans were a formidable naval power, constantly harassing Spanish and Italian shipping, raiding coastal towns, and threatening Christian Europe. For Philip, this was nothing less than a holy war, a continuation of the struggle that had defined Spain for centuries. He formed the Holy League with Venice and the papacy, and in 1571 their combined fleet, commanded by Philip's half-brother Don John of Austria, met the Ottoman armada in the Gulf of Patras. The Battle of Lepanto was one of the largest naval engagements in history, a clash of over 400 galleys and tens of thousands of men. It was a brutal hand-to-hand fight, a maelstrom of cannon fire, crossbow bolts, and clashing steel. And when the smoke cleared, the Holy League had achieved a decisive victory, crippling the Ottoman navy and shattering its aura of invincibility. It was a moment of immense triumph for Philip, a reaffirmation of Catholic might, and a potent symbol of Spain's role as the defender of Christendom. For a moment at least, the Mediterranean was secure. But while the East was momentarily quiet, new, equally devastating storms were brewing in the west and north. Consider the Netherlands. Inherited from his Burgundian grandmother, these 17 provinces were immensely wealthy, a hub of trade, industry, and vibrant culture. But they were also religiously diverse, with a growing Protestant population and fiercely protective of their traditional autonomies. Philip, a staunch Catholic and centralizing monarch, saw their Calvinist leanings and independent spirit as a direct challenge to his authority and to God himself. His attempts to impose stricter Catholic orthodoxy and centralize administration sparked a furious revolt in 1566. This wasn't a quick skirmish. It was a brutal 80-year struggle that would become a relentless drain on Spanish resources and manpower. The Duke of Alba, Philip's iron-fisted general, was sent to crush the rebellion, establishing the infamous Council of Troubles, dubbed the Council of Blood by the Dutch, and executing thousands. The Spanish tercios, the finest infantry in Europe, fought bravely, but the Dutch, led by William of Orange, proved incredibly resilient, using their unique geography, canals, dikes, and marshes to their advantage. It was a war of sieges, atrocities, and unimaginable cost, a festering wound that bled Spain dry for decades. And then there was England. Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant monarch, became a constant thorn in Philip's side. She openly supported the Dutch rebels, allowed her privateers, like the audacious Francis Drake, to raid Spanish treasure ships and colonies, and generally defied Spanish hegemony with infuriating audacity. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic claimant to the English throne, was the final straw. Philip, as the champion of Catholicism and avenger of perceived wrongs, felt he had no choice. He would launch the most ambitious naval invasion in history. In 1588, the Invincible Armada set sail. A massive fleet of 130 ships, carrying 30,000 men and 2,500 cannons, it was designed to sweep the English navy aside, land an army in England, and restore Catholicism. This was the ultimate expression of Spanish power, a testament to the wealth of the Americas and the strategic might built over a century. But the campaign was a disaster. The smaller, more maneuverable English ships, aided by superior tactics and, crucially, a series of fierce storms in the English Channel and around Scotland, decimated the Armada. Many Spanish ships were lost, thousands of lives perished, and the grand invasion failed utterly. It was a devastating blow to Spanish prestige, a psychological turning point, and a clear signal that even the mightiest empire was vulnerable. It didn't end Spain's dominance overnight, but it certainly cracked the illusion of invincibility. Yet, amidst these immense struggles, Philip II also achieved a remarkable expansion of his empire. In 1580, with the death of the last Portuguese king, Philip asserted his claim to the Portuguese throne. After a brief military campaign, he successfully annexed Portugal, uniting the entire Iberian Peninsula under a single crown. This was an astonishing coup. Overnight, Spain gained control of Portugal's vast colonial empire, including Brazil, its African trading posts, and its incredibly lucrative possessions in Asia, from Goa to Macau. For a time, Spain truly controlled the majority of the world's established sea lanes and overseas territories. The sun not only never set, it shone on an empire of unprecedented global scale. Back home, however, the Reconquista DNA continued to manifest in less glorious ways. Philip's Spain was deeply committed to religious uniformity. The Moriscos, descendants of the Muslims who had remained in Spain after the fall of Granada, were viewed with suspicion despite their forced conversions. Their distinct culture, language, and customs were seen as a threat, and restrictive laws were imposed, forbidding their traditional dress, language, and even baths. This repression boiled over in the Morisco Revolt of 1568 in the Alpujarras Mountains, a brutal uprising that lasted for 2 years and required a massive military effort to suppress. The eventual forced dispersal of the Moriscos across Castile and their later mass expulsion under Philip III demonstrated the relentless drive for a singular Catholic Spanish identity, even at the cost of economic and cultural diversity. Philip II died in 1598 after a reign of 42 years. He left behind an empire that was unquestionably the most powerful in the world, a global colossus with unmatched military strength and immense wealth. He had defended Catholicism, expanded his dominion, and created an administrative system that, however flawed, managed to govern a truly global entity. But the cost was staggering. Spain was perpetually at war, its treasury often empty despite the silver fleets, forcing constant borrowing and bankruptcies. The brutal exploitation of the Americas continued, fueling the empire but also creating profound human suffering and environmental devastation. The relentless pursuit of religious purity had stifled intellectual and economic vibrancy at home. The strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle had indeed made Spain powerful, but that fire had also consumed much, leaving an empire stretched thin, exhausted, and increasingly reliant on a single, finite source of wealth. The stage was set for the next chapter, one where the immense challenges of maintaining such a vast and complex dominion would truly begin to test the limits of Spanish might. Philip II, the prudent king, died in 1598, leaving behind an empire of unprecedented scale and complexity. We've seen how he wrestled with it, how he tried to bend it to his will from the austere confines of El Escorial. He left Spain the most powerful nation in the world, its banners flying from Manila to Mexico City, from Lisbon to Lima. But he also left a nation utterly exhausted, perpetually at war, and financially teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, its coffers drained by endless campaigns. The question we posed at the end of the last chapter, how long can such an improbable, overstretched and internally complex empire sustain its global dominance, was about to be answered, slowly and painfully, over the next century. Here's where the narrative of the Spanish Empire takes a turn that, from the outside, seems baffling. Imagine a colossal, intricate machine, built with incredible ingenuity and raw power, but now running on fumes, its gears grinding, its maintenance neglected. This is Spain in the 17th century. Philip II's son, Philip III, was a different kind of king entirely. Where his father was a tireless micromanager, Philip III was, shall we say, less inclined to the drudgery of governance. He preferred hunting, piety, and the arts to the endless stacks of documents that had consumed his father. This led to a significant shift in the exercise of power, the rise of the valido, or chief minister. For much of Philip III's reign, the Duke of Lerma held the reins, wielding immense power and wealth, often to his own benefit. It marked a move away from the highly centralized, intensely personal rule of the Catholic monarchs and Philip II. One of the most consequential decisions of Philip III's reign, and arguably one of the most self-destructive, was the final expulsion of the Moriscos. Remember them, the descendants of the Muslims who had remained in Spain after the Reconquista, many of whom had outwardly converted to Christianity, but were always viewed with suspicion, often secretly practicing their ancestral faith. Philip II had already brutally suppressed a Morisco rebellion in the Alpujarras. Now, fueled by lingering distrust, religious zealotry, and a convenient scapegoating for Spain's economic woes, Philip III decreed their complete expulsion in 1609. This wasn't a small thing. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Estimates range from 300,000 to 500,000, forced to leave their homes, often with just what they could carry, and sail to North Africa. Imagine the scale of that human tragedy. But beyond the immense suffering, the economic impact was devastating. The Moriscos were often skilled farmers, artisans and labourers, particularly vital in regions like Valencia and Aragon. Their departure left vast tracts of land fallow, depopulated entire villages, and crippled agricultural output. It was the final brutal act of the Reconquista's drive for religious uniformity, a victory for ideological purity over economic pragmatism, and a stark example of how a nation can weaken itself from within. For a brief period, Spain actually enjoyed a respite from war. Treaties were signed with England, and crucially, a 12-year truce was agreed with the rebellious Dutch provinces. It was a chance to rebuild, to consolidate, to address the profound internal issues plaguing the kingdom. But that chance was largely squandered. The immense wealth from the Americas continued to flow, though Potosi's peak production was beginning to wane. But it largely funded the crown's debts and the extravagant lifestyles of the nobility, rather than stimulating domestic industry or innovation. The price revolution, the massive inflation driven by American silver, continued to erode the purchasing power of ordinary Spaniards and make Spanish goods uncompetitive. Then came Philip IV, who ascended the throne in 1621. Like his father, Philip IV was more interested in hunting, theatre and the arts than the nitty-gritty of governance. He too relied heavily on a valido, but this time it was a man of extraordinary ambition and intellect, Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivares. Olivares was a visionary, a man who saw the cracks appearing in the Spanish edifice and genuinely tried to shore them up. He understood that Spain's immense power was paradoxically fragile, that its federated structure, with its myriad regional privileges and autonomies, made it difficult to mobilize resources effectively. Olivares' grand plan was the Unión de Armas, Union of Arms. His idea was revolutionary: to create a common army of 140,000 men, funded and supplied by all the kingdoms and territories of the Spanish monarchy, not just Castile. This was an attempt to centralize power, to distribute the burden of empire more equitably, and to make Spain truly a unified force. It was a bold, necessary move, but it clashed head-on with centuries of regional identity and fiercely guarded local privileges, and it came at the worst possible time. Because, my friends, Europe was about to descend into one of its most brutal and destructive conflicts, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. This was a continent-wide maelstrom, fueled by religious divides, Catholic versus Protestant, dynastic rivalries, Habsburg versus Bourbon, and a scramble for power and territory. As the senior branch of the Habsburg family, Spain was inextricably drawn in, supporting its Austrian cousins and battling Protestant German princes, the Dutch, and eventually the rising power of France. This was no longer about defending the faith or reclaiming lost lands. This was about maintaining Habsburg hegemony in Europe. Spain poured staggering amounts of men, money, and resources into this conflict. It fought on multiple fronts, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, and against France along its borders. The war was relentless, grinding, and utterly ruinous. The American silver, which had seemed so endless, was now swallowed whole by the insatiable maw of war. The Crown declared bankruptcy multiple times during this period, repeatedly defaulting on its loans. The sheer strain of Olivares's policies and the endless war proved too much for the already fragile union of Spanish kingdoms. The Union de Armas, intended to strengthen Spain, instead ignited a series of catastrophic internal rebellions. In 1640, Catalonia, fiercely proud of its ancient laws and autonomy, revolted against the imposition of Castilian troops and taxes. They sought protection from France, plunging Spain into a long, bitter conflict that would last nearly 2 decades. At almost the exact same moment, in the same year, Portugal, which had been united with Spain under Philip II in 1580, also rebelled. The Portuguese, tired of Castilian rule, heavy taxation, and seeing their own colonial empire neglected while Spain fought its European wars, seized the opportunity. The Duke of Braganza was proclaimed King John IV. This wasn't a small skirmish. It was a full-blown war for independence, which Spain, stretched thin and fighting on too many fronts, ultimately lost. By 1668, Portugal's independence was formally recognised. Imagine the blow. Spain had not only lost a significant part of the Iberian Peninsula, but it had also lost Portugal's vast global empire: Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Goa, Macau. It was a catastrophic amputation, a clear and undeniable symbol of the empire's overextension and internal decay. The strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle, that relentless drive born of desperation and faith, was now being tested to its absolute breaking point. By the mid-17th century, the political and military landscape was bleak. The decisive defeat at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, where French forces crushed Spain's famed tercio, light infantry regiments, is often seen as a symbolic end to Spanish military dominance in Europe. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, officially recognised the independence of the Dutch Republic, a final humiliation after 80 years of conflict. Spain was still an empire, yes, but its European hegemony was broken. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, where we encounter one of history's most profound contradictions. While Spain's political power waned and its economy struggled, the 17th century was, paradoxically, the Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age. This was a period of unparalleled artistic and literary brilliance, a cultural explosion that defied the political and economic gloom. Think about it. While the crown was going bankrupt, while the empire was losing chunks of its territory, while its people faced hardship, Spain produced Miguel de Cervantes, whose Don Quixote is arguably the first modern novel. It gave us Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca, who created a vibrant, prolific theatre that captivated audiences across Europe. And in art, the genius of Diego Velázquez, whose portraits captured the very soul of the Spanish court, the mystical intensity of El Greco, the profound religious devotion of Zurbarán. How could such cultural splendor emerge from such a period of decline? It's a testament to the enduring human spirit, to the deep wellsprings of creativity within a society, even when its political structures are crumbling. It shows that decline is rarely a monolithic experience. It can be a tapestry, woven with threads of despair and threads of extraordinary beauty. The introspection, the deep religious fervour, the sense of melancholy and stoicism that pervaded Spanish society during this challenging time, perhaps even fueled this artistic outpouring. It's a powerful reminder that history is never simple, never one-dimensional. As the century drew to a close, the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, ascended to the throne in 1665, known as, quote, 46, quote, the Bewitched. Charles II was a tragic figure, the unfortunate culmination of generations of royal inbreeding. He was physically and mentally infirm, often described as sickly and weak-willed. Crucially, he was childless. His reign was less about governance and more about the desperate manoeuvring of European powers over who would inherit the vast, sprawling Spanish Empire upon his inevitable death. The question of succession hung like a dark cloud over Europe, promising another cataclysmic war. Spain, the improbable, audacious empire, was at a crossroads. The strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle, that relentless drive born of desperation and faith, was now being tested to its absolute limits, stretched thin across a warring continent and vast oceans. The sun, once said never to set on the Spanish Empire, was starting to dip precariously towards the horizon. The great machine, though still magnificent in its scope, was sputtering. The question was no longer how it rose, but how and if it would survive the coming storm. The final years of Charles II were a slow, agonizing death watch for an entire continent. Imagine, if you will, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. An empire that still spanned two hemispheres, whose silver fueled global trade, whose flags flew from Manila to Mexico City, from Milan to Madrid, now held in the trembling, sickly grasp of a king so frail, so mentally and physically debilitated, that his very existence was a cruel mockery of royal power. He was, quite literally, quote, 47, quote, a man whose birth had been a desperate gamble to preserve the Habsburg line, and whose life was a testament to the dangers of generations of inbreeding. He was childless, and with him, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty would end. What happens when a colossus like this loses its head? What happens when a vast, interconnected web of territories, dependencies, and unimaginable wealth suddenly faces a void at its centre? The answer, as history so often demonstrates, is chaos. Europe held its breath, poised on the brink. Every major power, France, Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, had a vested interest, a claim, or a powerful fear regarding the succession. The balance of power, that delicate, constantly shifting scale of European politics, was about to be irrevocably shattered. Charles II, despite his infirmity, understood the stakes. He wrestled with his legacy, pressured by various factions, torn between his Habsburg heritage and the pragmatic need to preserve his empire. In his final will, a document that would ignite a continent-wide conflagration, he named as his heir Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of France's Sun King Louis XIV. Now pause for a moment and consider the audacity of this. Louis XIV, the most powerful monarch in Europe, had spent decades trying to dominate the continent, constantly at odds with the Spanish Habsburgs. Now his grandson was set to inherit Spain and its vast empire. From a Spanish perspective, it was a desperate gamble. Choosing a powerful Bourbon prince backed by France might be the only way to keep the empire intact, rather than seeing it carved up by greedy European powers. But for the rest of Europe, particularly the Austrian Habsburgs, who believed they had the rightful claim, and England and the Dutch Republic, who feared a Franco-Spanish superstate, this was an unacceptable, existential threat. And so, when Charles II finally succumbed in November 1700, the die was cast. Philip of Anjou ascended the Spanish throne as Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. But his crown was not easily won. The War of the Spanish Succession exploded, a brutal, exhausting, and truly global conflict that would rage for over a decade, from 1701 to 1714. This wasn't just a war between kings and empires, it was a civil war within Spain itself. The Crown of Aragon, which included Catalonia and Valencia, fearing the centralizing tendencies of a French-backed monarchy, and remembering their ancient fueros, their cherished regional privileges, largely sided with the Austrian Habsburg claimant, Archduke Charles. Castile, however, rallied behind Philip V. The struggle was devastating, tearing the very fabric of the peninsula apart, leaving a deep scar that would persist for centuries. We see armies marching across Europe, from the Low Countries to Italy, from the Rhine to the Iberian Peninsula. Marlborough and Prince Eugene, two of history's greatest generals, inflicted crushing defeats on French and Spanish forces at Blenheim, Ramillies and Malplaquet. The seas too were a battleground, as naval powers vied for control of trade routes and strategic strongholds. And in a pivotal moment, in 1704, a combined Anglo-Dutch force captured the Rock of Gibraltar, a strategic choke point at the mouth of the Mediterranean, a possession that would become a symbol of enduring contention between Spain and Britain. The war was a crucible, shaping not only the future of Spain, but the entire European order. It was a war of attrition, of shifting alliances, and ultimately of compromise. By 1713, after years of immense bloodshed and financial strain, the major powers were ready for peace. The resulting Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, and the subsequent Treaty of Rastatt, 1714, fundamentally reshaped Spain's European footprint and formally ushered in the Bourbon era. What did Spain lose? A tremendous amount in terms of European territory. The Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, went to Austria. Most of Spain's Italian possessions, Naples, Milan and Sardinia, also went to Austria, with Sicily going to Savoy, later exchanged for Sardinia. And perhaps most painful for Spain, Gibraltar and Minorca were ceded to Great Britain. In return, Philip V was recognised as the legitimate king of Spain, but with one absolutely non-negotiable condition. The crowns of Spain and France could never be united. Spain would be a Bourbon kingdom, but it would remain distinct from France. This was the price of survival, the cost of keeping the vast American empire largely intact. The strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle, that raw, yielding drive, had been stretched to its absolute limit, and now a new dynasty was tasked with picking up the pieces. The Bourbons arrived in Spain with a clear agenda: modernize, centralize, and revitalize. They looked across the Pyrenees to their French cousins, to the highly centralized absolutist state built by Louis XIV, and saw a model for reform. Spain, under the later Habsburgs, had become a patchwork of ancient laws, regional privileges, fueros, and a powerful, often independent aristocracy and church. The Bourbons sought to dismantle this old order, or at least bring it firmly under royal control. Philip V, after the war, immediately set about implementing the Nueva Planta decrees. These were revolutionary, effectively abolishing the separate laws and institutions of the Crown of Aragon, Catalonia, Aragon, Valencia, and Majorca, forcing them to adopt Castilian law and administration. This was direct punishment for their support of the Austrian claimant, but it was also a decisive step towards creating a truly unified Spanish state, rather than a collection of disparate kingdoms under one monarch. It was a harsh move, but it demonstrated the Bourbon commitment to central authority and uniformity. The early Bourbon kings, Philip V, and his successors Ferdinand VI and Charles III, were, for the most part, able and dedicated rulers. Their reigns marked a period of intense reform, often inspired by the Enlightenment ideals that were sweeping across Europe. We're talking about a comprehensive overhaul of the state, from top to bottom. They reformed the military, creating a more professional, standing army, and rebuilding the navy, recognizing that a global empire needed global reach and protection. They sought to streamline the bureaucracy, making government more efficient and less prone to corruption. They tried to reform the tax system, aiming to extract more revenue from the country and the colonies to fund their ambitions and pay down the crippling national debt. Economically, the Bourbons were mercantilists, like most European powers of their time, but they also understood the need for internal improvements. They invested in infrastructure, building roads and canals. They encouraged new industries and promoted a more efficient agricultural sector. The goal was simple: make Spain stronger, richer, and more competitive on the international stage. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Bourbon reforms was felt across the Atlantic in the vast American empire. For centuries, the Habsburgs had largely allowed the colonies a degree of self-governance, relying on the Criollo elite, American-born Spaniards, to administer vast territories with minimal direct intervention from Madrid. The Bourbons saw this as inefficiency, as lost revenue, and as a potential source of disloyalty. Their reforms in the Americas were designed to reassert royal control, maximize colonial revenue, and defend the empire against rival powers, particularly Britain. They created new viceroyalties, New Granada, encompassing modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. In 1717, permanently in 1739, and Rio de la Plata, modern-day Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay, in 1776, to improve administration and defense in strategically important but previously neglected regions. They liberalized trade, but with a specific goal. While they ended the old restrictive monopoly of Seville and later Cadiz, allowing more Spanish ports to trade directly with the Americas, this was not about free trade in the modern sense. It was about stimulating trade within the empire, ensuring that raw materials flowed to Spain and manufactured goods flowed back to the colonies, all to the benefit of the mother country. They also cracked down on contraband trade, which had long been a lucrative business for both foreign powers and local criollos. One of the most dramatic and controversial Bourbon reforms came under Charles III, arguably the most enlightened of the Spanish Bourbons. In 1767, he ordered the expulsion of the Jesuit order from all Spanish territories, both in Spain and the Americas. The Jesuits were powerful, wealthy, and fiercely loyal to the Pope, often seen as an independent power within the state. Their expulsion was a bold assertion of royal authority over the Church, and it sent shockwaves across the empire, particularly in the Americas where the Jesuits ran vast missions, schools, and land holdings. This act, while demonstrating Bourbon absolutism, also alienated many within the colonial elite who had been educated by or benefited from the Jesuit presence. Foreign policy under the Bourbons also shifted dramatically. Gone were the days of Spain fighting single-handedly against most of Europe. Instead, Spain forged a series of family compacts with Bourbon France, essentially formal alliances designed to counter the rising power of Great Britain. This led Spain into various conflicts, most notably the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, where Spain suffered significant losses, including Florida to Britain, though it would regain it later. Spain's involvement in the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, alongside France was another such effort, successfully weakening Britain and allowing Spain to regain Florida and Minorca. So, what do we make of this Bourbon century? Spain, under its new dynasty, was no longer the dominant hegemon of Europe, but it was far from a spent force. The Bourbons, with their French-inspired zeal for reform and centralization, had injected new life and efficiency into the Spanish state and its sprawling empire. They had tightened their grip on the Americas, modernized the military, and tried to stimulate the economy. But beneath this veneer of renewed strength, new tensions were brewing. The criollos in the Americas, increasingly wealthy and educated, resented the new, stricter imperial control. They felt that the reforms, while perhaps beneficial to Spain, were often detrimental to their own interests and autonomy. They saw peninsular Spaniards, the peninsulares, being favoured for high administrative positions and their own economic opportunities being curtailed. The seeds of future discontent, of a desire for greater self-determination, were being sown, even as the Bourbons sought to make the empire more robust. The strength forged in the fire of centuries of struggle had been reforged in the Bourbon crucible, but it was now a different kind of strength, one that held within it the very elements that would ultimately lead to its greatest challenges. As the 18th century drew to a close, Spain, under its revitalized Bourbon monarchy, faced a world rapidly changing, a world where the old empires would soon be tested by revolutionary new ideas and forces that even the most enlightened monarchs could not foresee.